Hello, Storm Geometeorologist Chris Saber with an updated outlook for the 2016 hurricane season. But before we look at this year, let's take a look at what happened last year. We had 11 named storms, 4 hurricanes, 2 major hurricanes. Danny lasted only a couple of hours as a major hurricane east of the Caribbean Sea. Most of the activity was north of the deep tropics, north of 20 degrees latitude. Generally up in this region here, we had 1 storm in the Gulf, Tropical Storm Bill, quiet Caribbean Sea last year, and that's very much what we expected. We thought it would be quiet down here in the deep tropics through the Caribbean Sea. We thought the prime development area would be here. This is from our last year's forecast. Secondary development possibly in the Gulf. Some of the analogs indicated some Gulf threat. We did see Tropical Storm Bill form here, but it didn't reach hurricane intensity before it moved into the Gulf Coast. Now, last year we had a very, very significant issue with wind shear across the Caribbean Sea. This is the plot of wind shear from 1949 all the way up to 2015, and the wind shear 2015, highest on record for the Caribbean Sea. Wind shear makes for a very hostile environment as far as development. What it does is it tilts the storms that are trying to develop a vertical column of squalls and develop that circulation in low pressure area. It really deters the storms from disturbances from developing. 2 types of wind shear. One is lighter winds at the surface, stronger winds aloft that tilt the thunderstorms, prevents them from developing that vertical core like they like when they're developing into hurricanes. Another type of wind shear is when you have winds blowing in different directions at the surface and aloft. That happens often during a strong El Nino, which is what we had last year. We had strong westerly winds aloft, strong easterly winds at the surface, and that caused the disturbances in the Caribbean Sea to twist and just get torn apart, and they weren't able to survive moving across the Caribbean last year. Last year's European model forecast for April, all these red lines are the European model members' forecast. The blue dashed line is what actually happened, and we can see that in general the model did pretty well in forecasting a very strong, in fact, near record strength El Nino that occurred last season. That's the reason for the very strong wind shear in the Caribbean Sea. What's the forecast for the coming season? Well, quite a reversal. Falling very rapidly from El Nino into neutral conditions by summertime, and by fall, the peak of hurricane season may be even into a weak La Nina, which would be an enhancing factor, certainly not the detrimental wind shear across the Caribbean Sea and Gulf that we saw this past season. We can see that the oceanic heat content in the tropical Pacific is declining very quickly. This is last season. Very high oceanic heat content led to a record year, a record number of hurricanes and major hurricanes from Hawaii on over to the coast of Mexico. Right now, that heat content is dropping very quickly. It's below normal, in fact, and that's a sign that El Nino is fading out and La Nina is coming back. And we can see that on the recent sea surface temperature graphic. This blue and green area here is cooler than normal water, now beginning to develop in the tropical Pacific, a sign of a coming La Nina. Over toward the Atlantic, we have much below normal water temperatures in the main development region east of the Caribbean Sea, which would be an inhibiting factor, not so much as far as development, but certainly as far as intensification. Hurricanes like that deep, warm water to develop into stronger hurricanes. We may be able to get some development here, but they would tend to be weaker because of the cooler water. Farther west, we certainly have above normal water temperatures in the Caribbean and Gulf and off the East Coast. No issue there with water temperatures. The European model also forecasts pressure levels across the tropics in the hurricane season. This is peak hurricane season. The European forecasting higher pressure from the Caribbean Sea over toward Africa, not as high as it was forecasting last year, a little bit lower pressures than last year was forecast, or is forecast, across the western Caribbean Sea and Gulf this season. European model also forecasts rainfall. Did pretty well last year, forecast very dry conditions from the western Caribbean Sea to the coast of Africa and the deeper tropics. And that pretty much was the case most of the season. This year, the forecast is for near normal rainfall from Africa on over, particularly through the Caribbean Sea and into the Gulf. So more normal rainfall might lead to more disturbances surviving across the Caribbean Sea to reach the Gulf of Mexico this year. And finally, the European model predicts where the storms may track or where they'll be least likely to track over a coming season. The blue areas here that extends from Africa to the coast of or to the eastern Caribbean indicates below normal activity, below normal track activity in that region this year, which indicates that we're looking at less than normal activity between the Caribbean Sea and Africa this coming hurricane season. Finally, we can take a look at some of the analog seasons, or seasons in the past with a similar setup going into the hurricane season. And looking at these analogs, we might be able to project what might happen this coming season if we have a similar setup. These are the years we've identified. The final column here is accumulated cyclone energy, which is a function of a hurricane's intensity and how long it lasts. A strong major hurricane lasting many days could get as much as 40 or 50 points. A weak tropical storm lasting as much as a day may only get a point or two. Average for a season is about 104. If we average all these analog years, we get about 100 about for an average season. However, we can see a couple of things here. The lines I highlighted in yellow are less active and sometimes significantly less active years than normal for some of these analogs. Like, for example, 1983, only 4 named storms in 1983. The ACE only 17. Very, very inactive season. But I'd also point out that in all of these seasons, including the inactive seasons, we did see a significant Gulf of Mexico and Western Caribbean hurricane threat. In 1983, we had Hurricane Alicia strike the Houston-Galveston area. 1970, we had Celia strike the Texas coast, very strong hurricane. And rapidly developing Umberto in 2007 off the upper Texas coast. Even in these inactive seasons, we had some significant threats to the Gulf Coast, particularly the northern Gulf Coast. We had Gilbert in 1988. One of the more active seasons that, we're pretty close to normal in terms of ACE, but the strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic up until Wilma in 2005. So kind of a mixed signal here as far as the analog seasons. Speaking of mixed signals, I think that's what we see for this year. Excuse me. Some of the indicators would say we're going to have an active season. Warmer tropical waters in the Caribbean and Gulf, near normal rainfall, which is an enhancement there for development. No El Nino, which would mean that the wind shear in the Caribbean will be much less. It'll be a more unstable environment there, more favorable for development. As far as the inactive season, we have higher pressure still in the tropics. We have warm water in the non-tropical, but in the eastern Pacific, north of the La Nina region, might be somewhat of an inhibiting factor as far as Atlantic development. And we have that cool water pocket, a very large area of cool water in the main development region now, which would be an inhibiting factor, at least as far as the far eastern Atlantic. I can promise you one thing, we're going to have at least one hurricane this year because we've already had Alex in mid-January. Alex developed as a non-tropical low by the Bahamas, moved across the Atlantic Ocean up towards south of the Azores where it gained some tropical characteristics and was classified as hurricane. So it became the first hurricane of the 2016 season. We think we'll see about 12 more named storms this coming season. The prime area for development, I think, to watch out for is that Western Caribbean Sea and Gulf. And anything developing here usually tracks on off to the north toward the northern Gulf Coast. That's why we think that the northern Gulf Coast may be at an enhanced risk for a hurricane impact this year. Secondarily, we think over here, now near the Bahamas, just east of the Bahamas, perhaps a threat to the southeast or east U.S. coast, the mid-Atlantic coast this coming season. We think it's going to be quiet in the deep tropics here, quiet in the eastern Caribbean. We think that's a less than normal chance for a significant impact across the islands of the eastern Caribbean Sea. Now let's take a look at the names that we're going to have this coming season. We've already had Alex. We think we'll make it all the way down to Matthew if we do make it to 13 total named storms, including Alex. Well, that's a look at the outlook for today. I'm storm geometeorologist Chris Hebert. Thanks for viewing.